Dust heat and two sisters. The air in Garnut Hollow that summer was thick enough to taste dry metallic and choked with dust that rose from the scorched ground in slow, suffocating swirls. The sun sat low but unyielding, hammering its heat into the backs of anyone foolish enough to stand still. Mercy was 19, though hunger and grief had already carved years into her face. Her bare feet rested on the splintered boards of the stage behind the livery house, the wood so hot it might have branded her soles if she stood there long enough. Beside her, Lark squirmed in her arms, swaddled in coarse, scratchy linen that smelled faintly of smoke. The baby wasn't yet 2, but she already understood how to be quiet. When it mattered, eyes half-lidded against the glare, as if the sunlight might blind her from whatever was coming next. The town itself looked as if it had been half-buried by time. Dry winds had scoured the hills, bare, stripping the bark from trees until they stood like skeletons against the horizon. No birds sang here, not in the heat, not after the fires. Garnut Hollow was the kind of place where nothing green lasted long, and where the law was less a written code and more a whispered agreement that some things were better left unspoken. Mercy had lived here once, or close enough to call it home, before the fire. Before the night, her mother's screams had been swallowed by the crackle of burning rafters and the hiss of collapsing walls. The official story was that her father had run a still under the barn, and that the fire was God's punishment for a sin left too long unchecked. 2 weeks after they buried what was left of her mother, they hanged him from the cottonwood outside the courthouse. The town didn't much care whether the 2 deaths were related. In Garnut Hollow, justice and vengeance were often the same thing, and no one dared to question the order of things once the rope had done its work. Now the only family Mercy had left was Lark, a bundle of warmth and weight pressed to her chest as the sheriff paced in front of them. She could feel the eyes on her from the crowd that had gathered, eyes ringed with hollows from sun and wind, eyes that had seen too much hard living to care about another pair of orphans. Her hair was still ash-stained from the fire, her brown dress faded to the color of earth clinging to the sharp lines of her body. She kept her chin down, not out of shame, but because meeting their stares felt like giving something away, and she had precious little left to give. The boards creaked beneath her weight, a single breath away from splintering, and in that moment, with the dust in her mouth and the baby's heartbeat under her palm, Mercy knew there were worse things than death, like being sold alive in the middle of a town that already considered you gone. The sheriff's call and the crowd's cruelty. The sheriff cleared his throat, his voice loud enough to carry across the dry, empty square. Girls strong enough for laundry, cooking, maybe milking. Baby ain't yet weaned, but comes with the girl. He might as well have been listing off the qualities of a mule for sale, his tone stripped of anything human. The crowd shifted spurs, jingling boots, scraping grit against the packed earth. No one stepped forward. The silence pressed in on her, broken only by the occasional cough or the creak of saddle leather. Someone in the back chuckled. Another man spat into the dust. A voice low and sharp suggested they take the baby off her hands and be done with it. Laughter rippled through the group like wind through dry grass, thin cutting and without mercy. Mercy tightened her grip on Lark until the baby whimpered, tucking her in closer as if to hide her from their words. The sheriff tried again. Starting at $2, he paused, scanning the faces for the smallest sign of interest. None came. Even at that insult of a price, she wasn't worth the trouble. Mercy's jaw locked, and she stared straight ahead, refusing to blink when a gust of wind kicked grit into her eyes. If they wanted to see her break, they would have to try harder. Then from somewhere near the back, a voice spoke quiet dry as tinder. "I'll take them." The sound drew every head in the square. A man stood apart from the others, hat brim low over his eyes, coat dusted with trail dirt. His horse was tied a ways off a lean, scarred animal that looked like it had seen as many miles as its rider. There was something in his stillness, a kind of patience that didn't belong in this place, and it unsettled the air around him. The sheriff squinted. Didn't catch that. The man didn't raise his voice, but the words carried just the same. "I'll take them both." A murmur passed through the crowd, part surprise, part suspicion. $2, the sheriff said, as if to confirm it. The man nodded once. That was all. Somewhere behind Mercy, a woman muttered into her hand, and a storekeeper leaned toward his wife with a lie about the stranger not speaking half the time. The sheriff shrugged, marked something down in his ledger. "All right, done. You got him?" Mercy didn't move when the man approached. She watched his hand extend toward her, not to take the baby, but to offer it, palm open, as if the choice to step down was hers. For a moment, she hesitated, the weight of Lark pressing between them like a question neither had yet asked. Then she placed her hand in his, wary, ready to pull back if his grip turned rough. It didn't. The silent departure. The man's hand was warm, rough with calluses that told of work done far from town walls. Mercy's fingers stayed tense in his grasp, but she let him lead her down from the platform. The boards groaned under their weight, and the sheriff stepped aside, without ceremony, already calling for the next lot. No one in the crowd followed them with their eyes. For long an orphan girl and her baby were worth less than the gossip that would fill the saloon that night. They stepped into the heat and dust, the noise of the auction fading behind them. The stranger said nothing, didn't ask her, didn't speak to the baby. He walked with a long, steady stride toward the hitch rail where his horse waited, each step crunching against the dry ground. The animal was lean ribs, faintly visible, its black mane knotted with dust and burrs. It lowered its head when the man came near, as if recognizing him in a way no one else did. Mercy watched him untie the reins and adjust the saddle without wasted motion. When Lark began to fuss, her whimper cutting through the stillness, the man glanced up not at Mercy, but at the baby. Without a word, he took the girl's free hand and placed it on the saddle horn. Then with a single motion, he lifted her onto the horse and steadied her there. Lark was nestled in her lap before Mercy had time to protest, the baby's tiny hands clutching the fabric of her dress. He took the lead rope and began walking slow enough that the horse's hooves didn't jar the child. Mercy glanced back once toward the crooked line of buildings shrinking against the horizon. No one was watching. No one was coming after them. She turned her face forward and didn't look back again. They traveled until the sky turned the color of old bruises, the land flattening into shadow under the sinking sun. The wind carried a cooler edge, now brushing against her cheeks, tugging at the loose strands of hair near her temples. Neither of them spoke. She didn't ask where they were going. There was nowhere else to go. And in the quiet footsteps of the man beside her, she found no promise of safety, but no threat either. At last, they reached a bluff overlooking a bend in the canyon. A cabin sat there, half dug into the earth as if trying to hide from the wind. Its roof was made of sod patched in places with rough planks, and the chimney bore black scars from old fires. The man led the horse to a small pen, tied it off, then gestured toward the door with a nod. Inside, the air smelled faintly of smoke and pine sap. He built a fire without comment, the flames licking up in uneven bursts. Mercy stood with Lark on her hip, watching him, unsure where to set her feet in this new, strange space. When the fire caught, he pointed toward a bedroll near the hearth. "You sleep there." It wasn't a question. She nodded once. Lark whimpered again, and he said, "There's goat milk on the shelf." "Pot's warm." That was all. Then he turned back to the fire, his face lit in shifting orange, and the silence settled between them like a contract neither of them had signed, but both understood. A quiet routine. In the days that followed, they fell into a rhythm that was less a life together and more a coexistence, two separate orbits crossing only when necessary. The man left before the sun rose, moving with the kind of purpose that didn't need explaining. Sometimes he returned at dusk with meat slung over his shoulder, fresh and dripping. Other times it was pelts, fox, rabbit, coyote that he spread on the porch to scrape and cure. Mercy kept to the cabin. She fetched water from a narrow stream a mile down, where a stand of aspen grew stubborn against the wind. She washed their clothes in the cold current using lye and coarse sand until her knuckles split. Lark, quick to adapt, stopped crying when left alone for short stretches. She played with whatever she could find, bleached bone sticks, bits of twine, and babbled in her own language while Mercy worked. The man didn't pray over meals, didn't bow his head to anyone living or dead. He didn't drink, and he didn't strike her, even the night she burned the stew so badly the cabin smelled of char for hours. He only glanced at her, the weight of his eyes, both unsettling and oddly steady, as though he saw something beneath her ash-stained skin that she wasn't ready to recognize herself. The land around them shifted as autumn drew near. The wind lost its dry summer bite and began to carry the warning chill of early frost. Mercy patched holes in the cabin walls with burlap sacking and moss, her fingers raw from the work. She pieced together clothes for Lark from scraps and hid the stitches uneven but strong. One morning, she woke to find him sitting at the edge of her bedroll, a whetstone in his hand, drawing the edge of a knife across it in slow, measured pulls. The fire had burned out in the night. Lark was curled against her, breathing softly. He didn't look up as he spoke. "There's men coming." Her body went rigid. "What kind?" "The kind that don't ask." Her stomach tightened. "For me?" He nodded once. "From town. Heard there was an orphan girl went cheap." She swallowed hard, her hand curling instinctively around Lark. "What'll you do?" He slid the knife into its sheath, stood and reached for a rifle hanging above the mantel. "I'll handle it." She gripped Lark tighter. "You don't know me. Don't have to." And then he was gone, his footsteps fading into the pre-dawn dark, leaving her with the low creak of the cabin settling and the faint beat of her own heart in her ears. First threat and the rifle. That night, the air in the canyon turned sharp, heavy with the scent of juniper. And something else. Something metallic and distant, like the breath before a storm. Mercy stayed awake long after Lark's breathing had gone deep and slow, her eyes fixed on the faint glow in the hearth. Every creak in the timbers, every whisper of wind through the sod roof set her nerves on edge. She didn't know what kind of men were coming, only that they were the kind who didn't ask. And that was enough. The sound came just before midnight, the far-off echo of hooves on rock, the faint clink of metal carried on the wind. Mercy tightened her hold on Lark and pressed her cheek to the child's hair. She thought of running, just picking up and slipping into the dark, but the idea died as quickly as it came. Out there was open land, nowhere to hide, and whoever was coming knew how to follow tracks. She didn't hear the man return until the door pushed open. The firelight caught him first, coat dusted in grit, a streak of blood on his sleeve, a fresh nick above his brow. His face was calm, his breath steady, like he'd only been checking traps. Without a word, he walked to the table and set a revolver down. The sound of it meeting the wood was heavier than it should have been. "Yours now," he said. Mercy stared at it. The metal caught the light in a dull sheen, worn from use, the wooden grip smooth from years of handling. "I don't," she began. "You'll need it." He didn't soften the words, didn't frame them as advice. They were fact. Her fingers hovered over the weapon, the weight of what it meant pressing down on her chest. She'd never held a gun that wasn't her father's old rust-pitted rifle, never touched one meant to be used at arm's length. Her gaze flicked to him, searching for something, warning comfort, maybe permission, but found only that same steady watchfulness. The room seemed smaller with the revolver between them. Lark stirred, whimpered once, then went still. Mercy curled her hand around the grip, the cold metal biting into her skin. She didn't know it yet, but that was the moment a line was drawn. Not trust, not entirely, but a thin tether between survival and silence. And neither of them would ever step back from it. Training in the cold. The first morning she tried to fire it. The air was brittle with frost. Her breath rose in clouds as she stepped outside the revolver, heavy in her palm. The man Boone, though she didn't yet know his name, stood by the porch rail, arms folded, eyes tracking her movements without a word. She picked a fence post as her target. The shot cracked through the cold, the recoil snapping her wrist back so hard it split the skin along the heel of her hand. She hissed through her teeth but didn't drop it. Missed by a yard. The man didn't correct her stance, didn't take the gun from her and show her. He only nodded once. Again. And so she did. Every day when Lark napped, Mercy would slip outside, plant her feet in the hard-packed dirt and fire until her arm ached. The sound rang across the bluff, echoing into the canyon and scattering the crows from the junipers. She missed more than she hit. The kick blood from the recoil made her wrists raw. Still, she kept going. By the third week, her shoulders had squared, her aim steadied. She learned how to load without looking, how to listen for the click before the chamber turned. One cold morning, Boone finally spoke more than a word at a time. "It's not about fighting," he said, watching her reload. "It's about finishing." The lessons didn't stop at the gun. He showed her how to set a snare for a rabbit, how to strip the hide in one clean motion without tearing it. She learned to stretch the pelt tight over a frame, to scrape the fat away until the skin was clean and dry. Her hands were often red with blood, her fingernails black with dirt, but she stopped flinching. When riders passed in the distance, Boone would send her and Lark into the crawl space beneath the floor, the air there stale with dust and the memory of hiding. Once 2 strangers stopped at the stream below. One of them pissed on the porch, the other asked if the place was empty. Boone's voice, low and steady, carried through the floorboards. Not empty, not welcoming. They left without looking inside. The wind turned mean in October. Snow crept down from the high ridges early that year. Mercy patched the cabin walls again, banked the fire before bed, and learned to keep the cold out as much as she could. The revolver never left her side now, not in the cabin, not even when she went to fetch water. She'd been sold for $2, but that price didn't matter anymore. The weight on her hip had changed everything. Illness and care. The first snow had barely settled when Lark's cough began, small at first, more a hitch in her breathing than anything else. Mercy noticed it while spooning thin stew into the child's mouth, the way Lark would pause, her little chest trembling before the cough rattled loose. By morning it had deepened, turning sharp and wet, each breath a struggle. The air in the cabin felt too cold no matter how high Mercy banked the fire. She tried the things her mother had once done, steaming cloths near the hearth, wrapping the baby tight in whatever warmth she could find. But Lark's cheeks stayed pale under the flush of fever, her eyelids heavy. Mercy's hands shook as she held her, afraid to loosen her grip, even to stir the stew. Boone noticed without her saying a word. He came in from the cold at dusk, a brace of rabbits slung over one shoulder, his coat carrying the sharp scent of pine. His eyes landed on Lark, then on Mercy's raw, chapped fingers. He didn't ask. He simply hung. His coat stepped outside again and vanished into the falling snow. Hours later, he returned with a small bundle of herbs wrapped in hide and tied with sinew. "Boil these," he said, already moving toward the hearth. Mercy watched him crush the brittle leaves with the butt of his knife, the bitter smell filling the cabin. "It'll taste foul," he warned. "She'll fight it." He was right. Lark turned her face away, clamping her lips shut. Mercy held her firmly, pressing the rim of the tin cup to her mouth until she swallowed, coughing harder from the taste. Afterward, Mercy rocked her in slow, deliberate motions, the baby's small body hot against her chest. They didn't speak much those nights, but something passed between them in the quiet, an unspoken acknowledgement that both of them were holding on to the same fragile thread. Boone would leave the good cuts of meat for Mercy, setting them wordlessly on the table. She began folding his shirts after washing them, smoothing the seams before hanging them to dry, though he'd never asked her to. Small offerings traded without ceremony. By the third day, the cough had eased, the fever breaking in a sheen of sweat. Lark slept hard, her breaths steady at last. Mercy sat beside the bedroll watching her, the revolver within reach. She didn't thank Boone out loud, just met his gaze across the cabin when he came in with fresh firewood. He nodded once. That was enough. Boots for Lark. Winter loosened its grip in slow, reluctant days. The snow softened into slush. The wind lost some of its edge, and the goats began to bleat more often, sensing the change. Lark's steps grew surer on the dirt floor of the cabin, her hands eager to explore beyond the bedroll. Mercy kept a close watch, always aware of how quickly a moment's inattention could turn to disaster. One morning, Lark toddled out past the low fence while Mercy was hanging damp clothes on the line. By the time she realized the child was knee-deep in mud near the goat pen, her dress hem heavy with wet clay. Mercy dropped the laundry and ran, scooping her up before she could fall. Mud smeared onto her own dress, streaking her arms. Her pulse thudded hard, the cold knot of fear sitting just under her ribs. When she turned back toward the cabin, Boone was standing in the doorway. His face was unreadable, his eyes shifting from Lark to Mercy. The words tumbled out before she could stop them. I ain't careless. He didn't flinch, didn't say you were. I watch her all the time. She pressed her voice tight sharper than she intended. I know. His tone was even almost gentle, but it struck deeper than if he'd scolded her. Mercy turned away quickly, blinking hard to keep her eyes from spilling. That night when the fire had burned low, she found something by the hearth, a small pair of boots, leather soft and carefully stitched. They weren't hers, and they weren't Boone's. She looked at him across the room. He didn't lift his gaze from the hide he was working. Found 'em in town, he said. Thought she might need 'em. Mercy crouched to slip them onto Lark's feet. The boots were a little big, but they kept her toes warm, the leather supple against her skin. Lark grinned, stamping them against the floor as if to test their strength. The gift said more than any words could have. It wasn't just protection for the girl, it was acknowledgement, quiet and certain that they were staying. The high trails and his reason. By summer, the wind had lost its bite, trading the harsh bite of winter for the resin-sweet smell of sun-warmed juniper. Boone decided they would take the high trails where the air ran thinner and the game was more plentiful. Mercy carried the rifle now slung across her back with the weight of something she no longer feared. Lark rode in a sling against her chest, her wide dark eyes tracking the movement of a hawk's circling overhead. The climb was slow but steady. Boone pointed out deer tracks pressed into the soft earth near waterholes. The claw marks where a bobcat had scaled a juniper trunk. Mercy listened, matching her steps to his without realizing it, learning to place her boots where the ground would hold without crumbling. There were moments when the world narrowed to just the sound of their breathing and the crunch of grit underfoot, and it felt like the rest of the world, crowds, auctions, ropes, fire had never existed. They camped one night under a rock overhang that smelled faintly of rain. Boone built the fire low so the flames didn't throw shadows far enough to give them away. Mercy sat across from him, Lark asleep between them, the rifle propped within reach. The question had been coiled in her chest since that first day in town, heavy as a stone. She spoke it before she could talk herself out of it. "Why'd you take us?" The fire popped softly, sending a spark into the night. Boone stared into it for a long while, his jaw working as if he were weighing the cost of answering. At last he said, "Because nobody else did." She waited, but he didn't look at her, just kept his gaze fixed on the flames. Then after another pause, he added, "I lost a sister once. Too young. Too much silence. Didn't figure I could undo that, but maybe I could keep it from happening again." He looked at her, then not like she was a child, not like she was a burden, but as though she was something in her own right, with her own weight in the world. The knot in Mercy's chest loosened just a little. She didn't trust him completely, not yet. But sitting there in the thin mountain air, the firelight painting lines across his weathered face, she began to think she might. A letter and a warning. Autumn returned hard and fast that year. The wind howled down the canyon like a living thing, snapping branches from the cottonwoods and sending the goats into restless fits. Mercy noticed Boone had grown quieter, sitting on the porch long after dark, with the rifle balanced across his knees. He never said what he was watching for, but she could feel it, a tension in the air, like the ground before a quake. One morning, she found a scrap of folded paper nailed to the fence post. No envelope, no stamp, just the raw paper creased and spotted with old blood. She pulled it free and read it twice before taking it inside. Boone didn't ask how it came to be there. He took it from her, opened it slowly, and scanned the lines in silence. His face didn't change, but the fire in the hearth seemed to burn lower as he read. Without a word, he stepped to the stove, struck a match, and set the paper alight. It curled into ash in seconds. What was it, she asked. A warning. From who he met her eyes then, and the weight in them made her wish she hadn't asked. Men I used to ride with. She wanted to press further, to ask what he'd done, who these men were, why they would send blood-stained paper from God knew where. But something in the way he looked at her, a quiet warning, all its own, made her stop. 3 nights later, Mercy woke to shouting. She rolled from her bedroll to see light flickering through the warped glass torches. Outside, 2 men circled the cabin on horseback, their shadows thrown huge against the walls. Lark began to cry, her voice high and thin in the smoke-scented air. Boone was already at the door, rifle in hand, boots on. "Take her to the crawl space," he said without looking back. "No." He turned his head, the first hint of surprise on his face. "You can't fight them alone. I've done worse. I won't hide." His jaw worked once, then he gave a single nod. "You watch the back. If they get close, shoot to kill." She took the revolver, Lark pressed tight to her side, and the night split open. The first man came through the side window. Mercy shot him in the chest before he touched the floor. The second made it as far as the porch where Boone was waiting, not with a gun, but with steel. When it was over, the smell of blood and gunpowder hung heavy. Boone leaned against the post, breathing hard. "They'll send more," he said. Mercy didn't flinch. "Then we kill more." Becoming a fighter, after that night, the cabin felt different. It wasn't the blood on the porch or the broken window, it was Mercy herself. Something in her had shifted. She began wearing a knife on her belt, not because Boone told her to, but because the weight felt right there, like it belonged. The girl who had once stood barefoot on an auction block, clutching her sister like a shield, was fading into memory. What replaced her was leaner, sharper, watching the world with an edge that no longer wavered. Lark, barely old enough to speak in full sentences, was learning faster than Mercy had expected. She could track the hoof marks near the goat pen, tell when they were fresh, and could gut a fish without flinching. The lessons came in quiet moments, Mercy showing her how to hold a short knife without cutting herself, how to keep her voice low when the wind carried far, how to move when you didn't want to be seen. Boone's training was different. He taught her how to listen for lies in a man's voice, how to make a fire without smoke, and how to vanish into the land so completely that even the wind would lose her. They went into town rarely, maybe twice a year, for salt, kerosene, and news. Mercy kept her head down when they did, one hand always resting lightly on Lark's shoulder, the other on the grip of a gun. It was during one of those trips that she saw it, her first wanted poster with Boone's face on it, nailed crooked to the side of the trading post. The sketch was close enough to be dangerous, though the bounty amount was low enough to tempt desperate men. She didn't tell him. That night, after Lark was asleep, she tore it down and burned it behind the goat shed, watching the paper curl and blacken in the wind. If anything, it didn't frighten her. It confirmed what she already knew. Boone had done things run from things same as her, but secrets were just another kind of scar. You carried them, or they rotted you from the inside. He never asked what she remembered of the fire that had killed her family, and she never offered. But some nights when the cabin was quiet and the coals burned low, Boone would speak in fragments about his own past, a town burned by mistake, a brother bleeding out in the snow, a woman who waited too long and then stopped waiting. One night, after a long stretch of silence, he said, "You know, they'll never stop coming." Mercy didn't hesitate. "I don't expect they will." "You got a choice," he said. "I already made it." She met his eyes. "I'm not a girl anymore." "No," he said. "You're not." Preparing for the next attack. Spring came slow that year, the land greening in cautious bursts. The goats birthed twins, and Mercy started building a smokehouse from stone hauled up from the canyon floor. Boone carved her a new holster, the leather dyed dark and etched with a pine needle pattern along the edge. It fit her hip perfectly, the revolver settling into it, like it belonged there all along. But trouble didn't wait for the season to turn. Word came from a trader that a man from the south had been asking for Boone by name, said he had a debt to collect, said he'd be bringing friends. Mercy didn't ask what the debt was or how long it had been waiting. It didn't matter. She began stockpiling ammunition, counting bullets twice before burying extra pistols in hollow logs near the creek crossing. She showed Lark the hiding places, teaching her where to go if the shooting started, how to stay still even when she was scared. They practiced in the dim light of the cabin, Lark crouching low in the corner, Mercy correcting the way she held her little knife. "Quiet," she'd whisper. "Like the world's asleep, and you don't want to wake it." One evening, Mercy caught sight of a campfire high in the hills. It was too far out for a traveler, and too still to be harmless. She left Lark with Boone and went alone, crawling through sagebrush until she reached the ridge. There were 4 men down there, 2 sleeping, one cleaning his rifle, one pacing the edge of the firelight. She didn't kill them. Not yet. Instead, she lay in the dirt and listened. What she heard chilled her more than the wind. They weren't just bounty hunters. They'd been hired by someone from the east, someone who had bought land rights to the canyon and wanted every squatter gone. And they knew about the girl, the one who shot men in the dark and taught a child to do the same. She slipped back to the cabin before dawn. Boone was waiting on the porch, his silhouette a dark cutout against the gray light. Lark slept inside, curled on her bedroll. Mercy stood in the doorway, dust streaking her cheek, wind tugging at her braid. "We're not running," she said. "No," Boone replied. "We're not." But she knew from the weight in his voice that the next time wouldn't be just another skirmish. It would be war. And this time she was ready to meet it head on. The first battle. The day the riders came, the air hung heavy, thick with heat that felt wrong for spring. The canyon was still the kind of silence that presses on the skin, telling you something's about to break. Mercy woke early, buckled her knife to her hip, checked her revolver twice. She braided Lark's hair tight, kissed her forehead once, and walked her to the root cellar. The hiding place smelled of earth and old apples, cool against the rising heat. Mercy crouched low, looking her sister in the eye. "Don't come out until it's quiet," she said, "or until Boone calls you by name." Lark nodded, her little face still as stone eyes, hard in a way no child should be. By noon they appeared, 8 of them, riding in a line across the bluff, like a moving shadow. Fresh coats, fine horses, faces wrapped against the dust. One wore a badge, another carried a folder thick with papers. They looked like they belonged to a world of rules, but their eyes told a different story. The lead rider, a man with a sharp beard and pale skin, stopped a few paces from the porch. "You're squatting on land owned by the Wilcox Trust," he called. "I'm here to see you off." Boone stepped forward, rifle loose in his hands, his stance steady. "Ain't nobody here trespassing. We made this ground ours by blood." The man's smile was thin, humorless. "Then I'll bury you in it." The moment his hand twitched toward his holster, the ridge came alive. Mercy had rigged it with snares wire and pit traps, and the first 2 horses went down screaming, their riders tumbling hard into the dust. The others scattered the tight formation, breaking. Boone's first shot took one in the chest. Mercy moved like a shadow, circling wide, her rifle across her back and both pistols in her hands. The first man she dropped never even saw her, just a crack, a spray of dirt, and he was gone. She didn't think about their faces or their names. She thought only of angles of the way the ground dipped and the wind-carried sound. Boone covered the south edge where the badgeman tried to flank. Gunfire tore through the fence line, goats scattering into the brush. Mercy took 2 more, each shot a clean break. The air stank of gunpowder and sweat, the grit between her teeth metallic with blood. By the time the dust settled, 3 men lay still. 2 more fled into the scrub, bleeding and cursing. Boone had taken a hit to the thigh, but kept his rifle up until the last shadow disappeared over the bluff. When Mercy reached him, she was already tearing strips from her shirt to pack the wound. He gave a ragged smile. "Didn't think you'd get the one behind the cart." "Then you don't know me like you think you do," she said, losing Boone. The next attack didn't come in weeks, it came in days. This time they brought more men, more guns, more fury. The morning was dim with low clouds, the smell of rain mixing with the acrid tang of oil from freshly cleaned rifles. Mercy knew they'd try to hit fast to overwhelm before the traps could thin their numbers. She and Boone had stayed up the night before, resetting every snare, checking every hidden weapon cache. At first light, she heard the rumble of hooves. She kissed Lark's hair, once sent her to the cellar without a word. The little girl's knife gleamed briefly in the dark before the door shut over her. Boone took the front. Mercy slipped through the back window like smoke cutting wide to the flank. She'd never killed a man face to face before, but the one she caught near the garden barely turned before her bullet hit him. The fight broke open in a tangle of noise, gunfire, shouted orders, the thud of boots on packed dirt. Mercy moved with precision, her world narrowing to the pull of the trigger, the sight of a target dropping, the feel of powder heat on her cheek. She caught glimpses of Boone through the haze, still upright, still fighting even when the blood spreading down his side turned his shirt dark. Near the porch, she saw him stumble, knees buckling. She was there in seconds, dropping the last man over his shoulder without looking. Boone grinned through the blood. "Taught you well," he rasped. "You're not leaving now," she told him, pressing cloth hard against his wound. "I already left years ago," he said, his breath catching. "Found something worth staying for. You, her." His hand twitched once, then went still. The fight wasn't over. Mercy screamed into the dirt, raw and wordless, then stood and finished it. The last man fell with a bullet between the eyes. By dusk, the clearing was quiet except for the wind. She buried Boone beneath the aspen where the light fell soft in the mornings, drove his knife deep into the soil as a marker. When she opened the cellar, Lark blinked at her in the fading light. "Is it over?" she whispered. "For now," Mercy said. Neither of them cried. That night they sat in the porch together, Boone's rifle across Mercy's lap, the fire crackling behind them. Coyotes called from far off. The stars came out bright and cold. Somewhere out there, more men would be planning, more paper would be signed, more guns loaded. But they would find something waiting, not a girl, not a squatter, but the beginning of a legend. Becoming Mercy, the hunter. In the weeks after Boone's burial, the cabin took on a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the silence of safety nor the strained hush that comes when danger prowls close. It was a heavier quiet, one filled with absence, like the air after a storm that had torn something from the land and left it bare. Boone's knife stayed buried beneath the aspen, its hilt just visible above the soil, catching the morning light like a small flame that refused to go out. Mercy began wearing her own knife openly, now strapped at her hip alongside the revolver. Not for show, not for memory, because it was the most natural thing in the world to do. She no longer felt the weight of it as an intrusion. It was part of her shape now, the way her braid was part of her silhouette, or the way her boots carried the dust of every place she'd walked. Lark stayed close those first days, shadowing her as she moved from task to task. She was old enough now to help without slowing things down. Mercy showed her how to wind fresh sinew for snare lines, how to stack wood so it caught quicker in the morning, how to recognize the faint tracks of a snake in loose dirt. Every lesson came wrapped in the unspoken truth that the world wasn't going to soften for either of them. The girl who had once been auctioned for $2 no longer existed. What remained was a woman with calloused hands and a gaze that met the horizon like it was a challenge. She kept the cabin repaired, the traps set, the goats fed, but her mind was always half turned outward, mapping the land for choke points and blind corners, calculating how long it would take to reach the rifle if the wrong knock came at the door. It didn't take long for whispers to travel. Traders spoke of a woman in the western bluff who carried herself like a hunter, who shot straighter than most men and lived alone with a child no man dared touch. They didn't call her by name, at least not in places where strangers could hear, but the stories grew teeth. Some said she'd once been a hired gun for a cattle baron. Others claimed she'd slit the throats of 3 bounty hunters in a single night. Mercy didn't care which lies took root. In truth, she encouraged them, letting the rumors build a wall higher than any fence she could hammer together. If men feared her, they might think twice before riding up her trail, and if they didn't, well, fear could turn to regret fast enough. Still, the land kept testing her. Stray riders passed within sight of the cabin more often now. Men with hard eyes who lingered just long enough to take in the lay of the place before moving on. Sometimes she thought she recognized faces from the auction crowd in Gannett Hollow, older now, meaner. She kept her rifle close and her ear tuned to the ground. At night, when the fire burned low and the wind curled through the canyon, she'd sit on the porch with Lark beside her, the stars sharp above them. The girl's head barely reached Mercy's shoulder, but already her eyes were the same steady, searching, unblinking. Mercy would pass her the little roar, the short-barrel pistol they'd practiced with, and Lark would hold it without flinching her small fingers, fitting the grip just right. The roots Mercy had planted here were deep now, built not with hope, but with defiance. And she knew as surely as she knew the lines on her own hands that the world would keep testing whether they were strong enough to hold. Becoming Mercy, the hunter. In the weeks after Boone's burial, the cabin took on a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the silence of safety, nor the strained hush that comes when danger prowls close. It was a heavier quiet, one filled with absence, like the air after a storm that had torn something from the land and left it bare. Boone's knife stayed buried beneath the aspen, its hilt just visible above the soil, catching the morning light like a small flame that refused to go out. Mercy began wearing her own knife openly, now strapped at her hip alongside the revolver. Not for show, not for memory, because it was the most natural thing in the world to do. She no longer felt the weight of it as an intrusion. It was part of her shape now, the way her braid was part of her silhouette, or the way her boots carried the dust of every place she had walked. Lark stayed close those first days, shadowing her as she moved from task to task. She was old enough now to help without slowing things down. Mercy showed her how to wind fresh sinew for snare lines, how to stack wood so it caught quicker in the morning, how to recognize the faint tracks of a snake in loose dirt. Every lesson came wrapped in the unspoken truth that the world wasn't going to soften for either of them. The girl who had once been auctioned for $2 no longer existed. What remained was a woman with calloused hands and a gaze that met the horizon like it was a challenge. She kept the cabin repaired, the traps set, the goats fed, but her mind was always half turned outward, mapping the land for choke points and blind corners, calculating how long it would take to reach the rifle if the wrong knock came at the door. It didn't take long for whispers to travel. Traders spoke of a woman in the western bluff who carried herself like a hunter, who shot straighter than most men, and lived alone with a child no man dared touch. They didn't call her by name, at least not in places where strangers could hear, but the stories grew teeth. Some said she'd once been a hired gun for a cattle baron. Others claimed she'd slit the throats of 3 bounty hunters in a single night. Mercy didn't care which lies took root. In truth, she encouraged them, letting the rumors build a wall higher than any fence she could hammer together. If men feared her, they might think twice before riding up her trail. And if they didn't, well, fear could turn to regret fast enough. Still, the land kept testing her. Stray riders passed within sight of the cabin more often now, men with hard eyes who lingered just long enough to take in the lay of the place before moving on. Sometimes she thought she recognized faces from the auction crowd in Gannett Hollow, older, now meaner. She kept her rifle close and her ear tuned to the ground. At night, when the fire burned low and the wind curled through the canyon, she'd sit on the porch with Lark beside her, the stars sharp above them. The girl's head barely reached Mercy's shoulder, but already her eyes were the same steady, searching, unblinking. Mercy would pass her, the little roar, the short-barrel pistol they'd practiced with, and Lark would hold it without flinching her small fingers, fitting the grip just right. The roots Mercy had planted here were deep, now built not with hope, but with defiance. And she knew as surely as she knew the lines on her own hands that the world would keep testing whether they were strong enough to hold. The campfire in the hills. It was late autumn when Mercy first saw the campfire, nothing but a faint orange pinprick high on the northern ridge, too far for a traveler stopping to rest, too still for a hunter's quick meal. She was splitting wood in the yard when the glow caught her eye, hovering above the tree line like a coal that refused to die. She stood there a moment, axe balanced in her grip, counting the beats of her own breath. A camp in that spot meant one of two things: either they were lost, or they were watching. She said nothing to Lark as she carried the last load of wood into the cabin. The girl was bent over her small sewing frame, repairing a tear in one of the goat-hide gloves Mercy had made her. Boone had always said not to stir the water until you knew what swam beneath it. Mercy intended to see for herself before she spoke. That night, after Lark was asleep, she checked the revolver, slung the rifle over her back, and slipped out into the dark. The canyon was moonless, the air holding the kind of cold that sank through leather and skin in minutes. She moved low, following game trails. She could walk blindfolded, letting the crunch of frost underfoot fall into the same rhythm as the wind in the junipers. The fire came into view, slowly flickering between the black teeth of the pines. 4 men. 2 asleep under bedrolls, one crouched with a rifle laid across his knees, the last pacing the fire's edge like a wolf in too small a pen. Their horses were tethered in the shadows, stamping at the cold. Mercy dropped to her belly, crawling forward until the scent of their coffee mingled with the smoke in her nose. She lay still, listening. The pacing man muttered to the one with the rifle. "She's here. I heard the stories. $2 and a baby, now she's picking off riders like game birds." The man with the rifle chuckled low. "Paid to clear the bluff, don't matter if it's her or any other squatter. Wilcox Trust don't want bloodlines like hers breeding on their land." Her jaw tightened. They spoke about her like she wasn't flesh and bone, just a problem to be solved, a name to scratch off a ledger. When the pacing man wandered toward the horses, Mercy slipped back into the dark. She could kill them now. 2 quick shots for the ones asleep. 1 for the rifle, the last for the wolf pacing the edge, but killing them here would just bring more faster. This wasn't the fight yet. This was the warning. She returned to the cabin in silence. Boone would have been waiting on the porch if he'd been alive. Instead, it was Lark she found sitting by the low fire inside, rubbing her eyes. "Where'd you go?" "Just checking the fences," Mercy said, setting the rifle down. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, the wind tugging her braid loose, the scent of that distant campfire still clinging to her clothes. When she finally spoke again, her voice was quiet but certain. "We're not running." Lark tilted her head, studying her. Then what Mercy's gaze went to the revolver on the table, then to the map of the canyon spread beside it. "Then we make sure they wish they'd never come." The final warning. The morning after she saw the campfire, the air felt sharper, like the whole canyon was holding its breath. Mercy rose before dawn, the frost on the grass crunching under her boots, and began walking the perimeter. Every step was a check where the snares were hidden, where the ground had been disturbed, where the ridgeline gave a clear shot down into the draw. She carried the rifle across her back, the revolver at her hip, and a coil of wire in her coat pocket. By the time the sun broke over the bluff, she had already reinforced the deadfalls, reset the pit traps, and marked 2 new positions where she could lie unseen with a clean angle on the trail. Lark followed her without complaint, carrying a bundle of sharpened stakes wrapped in burlap. The girl didn't ask questions anymore. She understood that silence was part of the work. They cached weapons deeper than before, 2 rifles in hollow logs, a scatter of pistols in rock crevices, extra rounds hidden under loose boards in the goat shed. Mercy dug a trench at the rear of the cabin, filling it with sharpened stakes, covering it with brush so it looked like nothing more than part of the bluff. "This isn't for them to see," she told Lark. "It's for them to remember if they live long enough." The next day, a single rider appeared on the ridge. He didn't come closer, just sat there in the cold morning light, his coat snapping in the wind. Mercy watched him from the porch, one hand resting on the rifle. He stayed long enough to make sure she'd seen him, then turned and rode back over the rise. That night, she found a scrap of paper nailed to the cabin door. No name, no date, just a crude drawing of a bluff with a black X over the spot where her cabin sat. Beneath it, 2 words, 3 days. Mercy held it over the fire, watching the edges curl and blacken before the flames took it whole. Lark stood beside her, the light from the hearth turning her eyes, the color of molten iron. "They're telling us when Lark said?" Mercy nodded. "Then we'll be ready." The next 72 hours were a blur of preparation. She moved like a woman possessed, measuring distances, sighting lines, driving nails through boards for barricades. Lark shadowed her, learning not just what to do, but how to see the land as a weapon. The goats were penned close to the cabin so their movement wouldn't give away traps. The root cellar was stocked with enough food and water for a week, though Mercy hoped it wouldn't come to hiding. On the second night, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke from the hills. Mercy stood on the porch, feeling the weight of the cold wood under her palms, her breath hanging in the air. Somewhere out there, men were waiting, sharpening their knives, cleaning their rifles. Boone's voice came back to her then from a winter-long past. "Don't just hold your ground. Make them bleed for every inch they think they've taken." Mercy turned from the dark ridge and went inside, closing the door against the wind. 3 days, she murmured more to herself than to Lark. Let's make them regret every second of it. The war for the bluff. The morning of the 3rd day broke without birdsong. Even the goats were silent, huddled together in the pen as if they could feel what was coming. Mercy rose before first light, her breath clouding in the cold, and buckled her knife. She checked the revolver, twice felt the weight of it settle into the holster, then slung the rifle across her back. Lark's braid was already tight, her small hands wrapping the strap of her little knife like it was part of her skin. Root cellar, Mercy told her. Same rules. You stay until it's quiet, or until I call you by name. Lark nodded, eyes hard. Don't get killed. Mercy managed the ghost of a smile. Not planning to. She knelt, pressed a quick kiss to the girl's forehead, then closed the heavy door over her. By mid-morning, the riders crested the far ridge, 10 this time, maybe 11. They moved in a staggered line, rifles across their saddles, faces shadowed by wide brims and dust cloths. One carried a flag of sorts, a strip of canvas, painted with the Will Cox Trust emblem fluttering limp in the still air. Mercy was already in position, lying flat in the brush above the north trail. From here she could see the wire she'd strung between 2 low boulders, the shallow pit masked with sage, the glint of nails hammered into boards that were buried just deep enough to ruin a horse's leg. The lead rider signaled, and the group began to fan out. The first 2 hit the wire in unison. One horse went down screaming, the other bolted sideways into the pit, snapping a foreleg. Shouts erupted. 2 men dismounted to drag the riders clear, and that's when Mercy fired. The first bullet took one through the throat. The second slammed into the other's chest. Gunfire cracked from the south edge, Boone's old blind, now hers. A second volley dropped another man. The rest scattered, trying to find cover where there was none. Mercy moved constantly, never staying in the same spot for more than a breath. The land was hers now. Every ridge and hollow had been set for this moment. She circled behind them, her boots whispering against the sand, and dropped another rider before he could even turn. A voice shouted from below, deep commanding. "You can't hold this ground, girl. You're just meat delaying the knife." Mercy leaned out from behind a juniper, sighted down the rifle, and answered with a shot that took his hat clean off and carved a red line along his scalp. His horse bolted, nearly trampling another man in the chaos. The battle churned for what felt like hours, but was only minutes, dust rising in choking clouds, the air thick with powder smoke. Two tried to flank along the goat pen. One tripped a snare and went down screaming. The other fell to Mercy's revolver before he cleared the fence. When it was done, 5 lay dead on the bluff. 3 more crawled away, blood trailing behind them, too broken to mount their horses. The survivors didn't look back. Mercy stayed where she was until the sound of hooves faded into nothing. Only then did she rise, walking slow toward the cabin, her shadow stretching long in the afternoon light. She opened the root cellar door. Lark's eyes found hers instantly. "It's quiet," Mercy said. "For now. The aftermath." The bluff smelled of iron and smoke. It clung to the air thick enough that Mercy could taste it when she breathed. The sun had climbed higher, pale and sharp in the washed-out sky, but the light didn't warm the ground. Not here. Not after what had happened. She led Lark out of the root cellar, one hand on the girl's shoulder, the other still resting on the revolver at her hip. Lark's eyes went wide at the sight of the bodies scattered across the bluff, men who had come to take what wasn't theirs and found the land itself turning against them. She didn't cry. She didn't look away. That unsettled Mercy more than if she had. They moved together, deliberate and slow. Mercy checked each body, kneeling only long enough to see if any breath remained. Those who were still alive didn't stay that way for long. There was no room here for second chances, not for men who'd ride back with twice the number if spared. She worked with quiet efficiency, the metallic ring of spent shells slipping into a coat pocket, the only sound between them. Once the work was done, they dragged the dead to the gully behind the goat shed. Mercy's muscles burned with the effort, the weight of each man heavy in a way that had nothing to do with flesh. She dug deep graves, the earth cold and reluctant to give. Lark stood, watch rifle clutched in small hands, scanning the ridges like she'd been doing it all her life. When the last mound of dirt was patted down, Mercy planted a wall of thorn brush over each grave. Not for respect, not for memory, only to keep animals from digging and to make the place less inviting for anyone stumbling close. Inside the cabin, the silence pressed even heavier. The goats were restless, pacing their pen. The boards over the windows bore fresh scars from stray bullets. Mercy set to work immediately, patching holes, resetting the barricades. Lark swept the floor, her small frame moving between the beams of light that cut through the gaps in the wall. Later, as the sun dropped behind the canyon rim, Mercy lit the fire and poured water into the dented tin pot. She cleaned the rifles, laid them in their places, and checked the ammunition again. Her fingers moved with the same methodical pace as her breathing, slow, steady, unbroken. When all was quiet, she stepped outside. The bluff was washed in deep orange, the wind low and cool. Coyotes yipped somewhere beyond the ridge, but even they kept their distance tonight. Lark joined her, slipping her small hand into Mercy's without looking up. "Will they come again?" Lark asked. "Yes," Mercy said, her voice flat. "They always do." The girl nodded, as if that answer was both the truth she expected and the one she could live with. Mercy looked out over the canyon, her silhouette hard against the last light. This ground was theirs, not because it had been given, but because they had taken it, paid for it in sweat and blood, and dared anyone to try and take it back. And the ones who did, well, they were already in the ground behind the goat shed. The trader's delivery. It was late July when the trader came, a gaunt man named Jonah, whose horse looked as if it had been run half to death. Mercy was mending the fence line when she saw him crest the ridge, dust trailing behind like smoke. He didn't dismount, didn't even slow until he was within spitting distance of the porch. His eyes were wide, his face drawn tight. "Got something for you?" he said, his voice cracked from the heat. Without another word, he pulled a small wrapped parcel from his saddlebag and tossed it to her. The thud of it hitting her palm felt heavier than its size should allow. Jonah wheeled his horse before she could ask anything and rode off, never looking back. Inside the cabin, she unwrapped it on the table. Inside was a folded scrap of parchment, a handful of silver coins, and a torn corner of a larger page. On that fragment was her name, not her full name, but enough to sting, written in a hand she didn't recognize. Above it in rough ink was Boons. She turned it over once then again, as if the paper might give her more if she held it long enough. Lark stood by the doorway watching. "Who sent it?" she asked. "Doesn't matter," Mercy said. But in her gut, she knew whoever had written those names wasn't just sending a message. They were laying claim. That night she handed the paper to the fire, watching the edges curl and blacken the ink blister and vanish. Lark stepped closer, eyes fixed on the flames. "They're looking for you now," the girl said. Mercy didn't answer. She was already thinking of where to hide more ammunition, which trails to block, which ridges gave the longest line of sight. The silver coins stayed in a tin under the floorboard, not because she meant to spend them, but because every coin carried the stink of a bounty meant to buy her life. The next hunt. Mercy didn't wait for them to come. She began building the wall before the first scout arrived. The land around the bluff became a lattice of traps, choke points, and hidden caches. She dug trenches just deep enough to hide a prone shooter, covered them with brush. Hollowed out the base of an old juniper to hold 2 rifles wrapped in oilcloth. Buried food and water at 3 separate points in case the cabin was taken. Lark's training grew harsher. She practiced loading while moving, learned how to shoot from a crouch, how to reload with her eyes closed. Mercy taught her to move through the brush without breaking a twig, to climb the bluff face without loosening so much as a pebble. "They'll come in numbers," Mercy told her one evening as they sat skinning rabbits. "Better armed, maybe with badges. Don't let the badge fool you, it's just another way to make murder look tidy." The waiting was its own kind of fight. Days passed in the tight coil of anticipation. Mercy would scan the ridges at dawn and dusk, seeing nothing but knowing they were out there somewhere. When the first sign came, it was small, a single horse print near the creek crossing, fresher than any goat track, too heavy for a lone traveler. Then, another days later, on the east trail, they were testing the edges, learning the ground. Mercy marked each one in her mind, tightening the web. By the time she saw the glint of a spyglass from the far ridge, she was ready. The bluff was quiet, the traps reset every weapon within reach. Lark's braid was tight, her knife strapped against her thigh. They didn't speak about the fight to come. Words wouldn't change the fact that it was already moving toward them like a storm. Roots and vengeance. The day they came, the sky was a white sheet, the heat pressed flat against the land. From the porch, Mercy watched them ride in 12, this time their formation, tight rifles, slung faces, hidden behind cloth. One bore the Wilcox Trust banner, again high like a challenge. Another wore a badge that caught the sun gleaming like false hope. Mercy sent Lark to the cellar. "Same rule," she said. You hear me call you come? Not before. Lark nodded, once eyes steady, then vanished below. The first volley came from the ridge Mercy's own rifle, hidden in the hollow juniper now in her hands. The shot dropped the lead rider before his horse had time to scream. Chaos rippled through the formation. 2 more went down in the traps she'd set along the north trail. They tried to circle wide. That's when she moved low and fast, cutting between the rocks, firing from cover, each shot clean and certain. The badge man made it within 20 paces before she dropped him with a shot to the chest. The fight churned in dust and gunpowder. Shouts, the thud of boots, the sharp whine of ricochets. Mercy never stayed still long enough for them to pin her down. Her mind working the ground like a chessboard she'd been playing for years. When it ended, the bluff was quiet, but for the wind. 9 men lay still. The rest fled, bleeding into the horizon. Mercy stood at the center, breathing hard blood, hers and theirs, spattered across her shirt. She opened the cellar. Lark climbed out, knife in hand, eyes scanning the ground like she'd been born to it. Over, she asked. For now, Mercy said. They buried the bodies in the gully behind the goat shed, thorn brush thick over each mound. That night they sat on the porch. The rifles within reached the stars, sharp above them. Mercy knew there would be more men, papers, reasons. But they'd find the same thing the last ones did not: a girl, not a squatter, but a name carried in whispers. The girl who walked off the auction block for $2, built her life on blood and grit, and made the world fear her. And beside her, growing stronger every year, the little sister no man would ever touch again.